So the other day, I came across a post on Facebook that I think is important to take a look at for today's session. The post reads, "I dream of never being called resilient again in my life. I'm exhausted by strength. I want support. I want softness. I want ease. I want to be amongst kin, not patted on the back for how well I take a hit or for how many." Let me read that again. "I dream of never being called resilient again in my life. I'm exhausted by strength. I want support. I want softness. I want ease. I want to be amongst kin, not patted on the back for how well I take a hit or for how many." So that was the post. And the responses to that post were overwhelmingly reflective of its sentiment, meaning literally hundreds of people responded in ways that shared and supported what was being expressed. So let me read you some of the responses to that post. One person wrote, "I feel this in my soul right now." Another person said, "I just want to be held, knowing that I'm in safety, so I can just rest, not having to forge on alone." Another person wrote, "I am so emotionally wiped out, no more to give. I have buried so many people in my life, and it's not done yet. A very important one is on the edge. Too much giving. I need some rest." Another person wrote, "So sick of being resilient and stoic and any other description that implies you just have to keep going." The last one that I'll read says, "My heart is exhausted trying to get through each day without my husband, but I will continue to find the strength to do exactly that for my boys. Yes, they are resilient, but they shouldn't have to go through this life without their dad. They shouldn't have to go through this life without their dad. Cancer is an evil disease." So a lot of suffering is expressed here, and a lot of people expressing that they're kind of at the end of their ropes with this resiliency thing. And maybe you can relate, like, how long are you supposed to be resilient for? What's the breaking point? And is there possibly a better way, a more helpful way to begin to relate to life so that it doesn't just become a series of hits that you're always being asked to endure, right? Like, might there be a more helpful way to relate to and understand life so that we don't set it up as something we need to simply be resilient in the face of? So that's what we're going to take a look at today in this workshop, a potentially more helpful way, a more beneficial way of understanding and relating to life so that it can hopefully begin to feel less like something you just have to endure, so that you can begin to feel more in the flow of life rather than you're being chewed up by it, right? Chewed up and spit out by it sometimes, right? So really what that post that I just read and a lot of the responses to that post, what they're showing us is something that I call the resiliency cycle. The resiliency cycle. So getting caught up in the need to be resilient over and over again until you just feel wiped out, right? Like you just don't have the strength for it anymore. If we refer back to that original post, there was that line in it that said, "I'm exhausted by strength. I'm exhausted by strength." There's something there for us to learn about and to examine that can be helpful. Because when even being strong feels exhausting, you're probably caught in what I call the resiliency cycle. It's a good indication, right? So let's break things down a little bit. Let's take a look at first what resiliency is. So a real clean, clear definition that can help us here today is this. Resiliency is the reorganization through rapid change after a destabilizing event. Let me say that again. Resiliency is the reorganization, the ability to reorganize through rapid change after a destabilizing event, right? So it's the ability to bounce back, to reformulate, reorganize how we're doing things within a relatively short amount of time, depending on how destabilizing the event was, right? So as to be able to continue on, to keep living. And the resiliency cycle is getting caught up in a cycle of that. So it's when you experience one destabilizing event after another. So you're reorganizing and rebounding after one event, only to get hit by another event that destabilizes you and that you need to reorganize and rebound from. And then you get hit by another, and then another after that. This is what I would call the resiliency cycle, getting hit with a series of events that destabilize you and that you feel like you need to rebound and recover from. I think this resiliency cycle might be what a lot of those people who were responding to that Facebook post were going through. And maybe what some of you listening here today might be feeling like you've been going through yourself. I've heard my own self reflect that cycle. So in some of my live daily meditations that I host, I've heard myself say, it's like we just got through the pandemic and now a war with Russia and the Ukraine. It's like reflective of the resiliency cycle, right? So it's like that sense of getting through one event that destabilizes us, only to get hit with another. And as I always say, anytime we get caught in a loop or a cycle, suffering is sure to follow. Anytime we get caught in a loop or a cycle, suffering is sure to follow. It's one of the ways that suffering manifests, through loops and cycles that we get caught in throughout our lives, be it loops of ruminative thinking. It's hard to say ruminative. Be it loops of ruminative thinking, or cycles of recovery and relapse, right? Or cycles of violence or of anger or of depression. So what I'm going to do in today's workshop is I want to take a look at first what makes an event so destabilizing for us. That's the first thing I want to take a look at. What makes an event so destabilizing for us? And then second, I want to take a look at how we might potentially use our mindfulness practice to begin to feel less destabilized by some of these events in our lives in the first place. So if we can bring our mindfulness practice to the root of things, in this case, to how we relate to and view and experience the destabilizing event, we just might need to be resilient less. Let's let that sink in for a moment. So if we're not as destabilized by the things that happen in our lives, we might not need to be so resilient in the face of them. Like if you don't get destabilized by something, you don't need to call on the strength of resilience in order to move through it. This is one of the things that can help take us out of the resiliency cycle. And it's what I call mindful resiliency. Mindful resiliency is less about using our mindfulness to deal with the after effects of destabilizing events, and more about bringing our mindfulness practice into what causes an event to be so destabilizing to us, so that events destabilize us less and less. Okay, so stay with me. I teach a class called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction. It's an 8-week foundational level program in mindfulness and how to use mindfulness to reduce our stress, right? Mindfulness-based stress reduction. And in it, I try to make clear that it's not a stress management program. We are all already managing our stress somehow, or else we wouldn't even be able to be in the class in the first place, right? It's stress reduction. We want to learn how to reduce our stress, how to bring it down, not just manage it. And the only way to do this is to go to the source or the root of what causes us stress in the first place. That's where we need to apply our mindfulness if we want true stress reduction instead of stress management. So dealing with the after effects of stress is stress management, and it's still really important, but that's what it is. And dealing with the source or what causes the stress, where it comes from, and bringing our mindfulness there, that's mindfulness-based stress reduction. And the same goes for this teaching here today. We want to go to the source, the root of why we get so destabilized by certain life events, so that we can bring our mindfulness practice there, so that, again, we can potentially get less destabilized by them in the first place. If we truly want out of the resiliency cycle, out of the need to just keep recovering from blow after blow after blow, we need to bring our practice to the source of what's creating the blows for us, what's creating our stress and suffering, or what's actually creating the destabilization. Now, most people would say that it's the events themselves that create the destabilization. And sometimes this is true. You lose a child, for example, or a close loved one. Someone is killed through violence or a sudden accident, or your country goes to war, right? Or you suddenly lose your source of income, or you receive a diagnosis or a prognosis. So there are events that happen to us in this life, no doubt about it, that in and of themselves, pretty much no matter your mindfulness practice, will destabilize you. And I want to make that clear and to kind of build some space and some compassion around that. No matter how much we meditate, there are events in our lives that will happen to us that will destabilize us and that we will need to somehow recover from. But if we can use our mindfulness practice to enable and empower ourselves to be destabilized less and by fewer events, or in other words, if we could use mindfulness to more consistently ride the waves of life, surf the waves of life, rather than getting knocked down repeatedly by so many of them. If we can learn how to use mindfulness to more skillfully surf the waves of life, this is what's going to help take us out of the resiliency cycle. And then when the big stuff happens, we might actually have the strength at those times to meet it, to reorganize, and to bounce back.